Well, thank you so much for tuning into our presentation. Our project this year is called Facing the Future, Leveraging Punjabi Social Networks to Grow a Sustainable Tomorrow. We took a close look at the effects of climate change on small-scale farmers in the state of Punjab within India, and then proposed revisions to the current Farmer Field Schools program to help prepare small-scale farmers for the effects of climate change in future years. So we jump to the next slide. I'm going to do a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing today. First, we'll do a overview of Indian agriculture and the general importance of agriculture within India. And coupled in that section, we'll talk a bit about the effects of climate change in South Asia as well. Then we're going to be taking a closer look at Punjab, which is considered the granary of India. And then moving next, we're going to be moving into leveraging word of mouth through social network policy, looking at specific case studies and other projects done in India and around the world for inspiration for our eventual policy solution, which we'll discuss at the end. So we jump to the next slide. Let's take a quick look at India and agriculture. So currently about 43% of India's workforce is in the agricultural sector, according to the World Bank as of 2019. Even more than that, 56% of the country's landmass is covered in farmland. And it is a major source of livelihood for India's population, as currently about 65% of India's population rely on rain-fed, smallholder agricultural lifestyles to sustain their livelihoods. So this is an incredibly important sector, both for the social and economic makeup across India. However, jumping to the next slide, climate change is posing a serious threat to the stability of both India's water supply as well as India's agricultural sector. So India is facing a serious water shortage crisis. Currently, about 600 million people in India are experiencing acute water shortages. And 80% of freshwater use is used for farming. And so revisions to the farming sector can not only help to save water that can be used for local populations as well as other industries. The worsening of the water crisis due to the effects of climate change and rising populations and other factors could cause just exacerbated issues relating to the agricultural sector and general effects on local communities. A major issue that we've found within India's agricultural sector is that there is a homogeneous crop distribution. As of 2011, 85% of India's grain output was composed of rice and wheat alone. And rice and wheat were found to be incredibly susceptible to the effects of climate change, with an expectation that these crops will have a 2% decrease in yield per year in years to come due to the effects of climate change. So it's important that we diversify the crop distribution within India. But we're going to be talking a little bit more about those solutions towards the end. So I'm going to pass it over to Gabby to give a closer look to Punjab, which is considered the granny of India.
Perfect. Thank you, Ben. So the reason that we have chosen to focus on Punjab specifically within India is because, interestingly, it was the center of the Green Revolution in the 1960s. So this was when the United States intervened in Indian agriculture in order to avoid famine. So what you see here is a graph that kind of shows the general increase in food production of food grains specifically over the past 6 decades. And this is mostly thanks to the introduction of Western technologies such as high yielding seeds and fertilizers. So here you can see that Punjab has a significant production of wheat and rice within India, but also globally and on the world for the world. So they produce 20% of the wheat in India and 2% of that of the world. And they produce 9% of the rice in India and 1% of that of the world. Surprisingly, most of Punjab's farmers are actually smallholder farmers. So 29% of Punjabi farmers own less than 1 hectare of land, meaning they either own this land and it's a very small plot of land, or they rent the land that they work on. And then 27% own between 1 to 2 hectares of land. So a majority of the farmers in Punjab are considered smallholder farmers. So looking into kind of the current atmosphere of Punjab and Punjab's farmers, You'll find that recently there has been a lot of farmer protests. They've been going on since 2020 and is still ongoing today. And this is because the ruling BJP party in India has been attempting to repeal the laws from the Green Revolution. Um, and and this is problematic for a couple of reasons, but three notable acts that we can see being put forth by the BJP are the following. So, one act deregulates trade spaces or what's known as mandis. A second act rearranges the deals for trade deals to be strictly between farmers and traders. And then a third act eliminates crop storage limits. So, what this means is altogether, the three acts generally sort of make farmers to be more vulnerable in competing market prices, kind of taking away their ability to sell their crops at a level that would allow them to sustain their livelihoods. And so the result of this is farmer suicides. The rate of farmer suicide in Punjab is really high, and this causes a distrust between farmers and the government. So, one advocacy group in particular, called the Movement Against State Repression, estimated that there were at least 20,000 deaths in Punjab alone from the years of 1988 to 2008. And so, most of these deaths can be attributed to farmer deaths, which root from weak agricultural infrastructure. So, what we saw earlier, that was the result, that was the cause for higher yields for the farmers' production of grains, which was the high yielding seeds and fertilizers. So actually, they're really expensive for these farmers, and so in order to be able to afford these resources, they kind of dig themselves into greater and greater debt. And then as a result of that, when they're not able to sort of pay off these debts, some of them choose to resort to suicide. And so we want to acknowledge that there has been effort on the Indian government side to try and mediate or remedy this issue. So one venture in particular is called the DD Kisan 24-hour television channel. It's a TV channel that streams agricultural information. So this includes anything between weather forecasts to what farming techniques, and they're trying to disseminate information among farmers in order to improve their livelihoods. But we think that we can do better and find this sort of better solution for this problem. So next, I'm going to hand it off to Jimena, and she's going to be talking more about Punjabi demographics.
Thank you, Gabby. So I think that it is important to identify what the real origin of this mistrust is. And I think we can find the answer if we study demographics very deeply. And one of the things, or three of the things that we found, was that firstly, there's a trend in Punjab's rural demographic that shows that growth rates have been trailing compared to urban rates. And that is mainly due to industry growth in urban areas. And the second trend that we've seen is that rural population is becoming increasingly old. And that is mainly due to young people moving to urban industry. But that does mean that at least 90% of the rural population remains unmatriculated, which means that they have not accessed basic levels of education. And so even though literacy rates have been seen rapid growth, we believe that this inaccess to basic level of education and this rapid growth of the older side of the population is a major contributor in resistance to tech adoption or even government mistrust. So now I'm going to hand it to Kevin, who is going to talk about leveraging word of mouth and our approach to the solution.
Yeah, so in response to some of the demographic changes that Jimena was talking about, what we found is that like at the end of the day, this aging group of farmers trust each other. They trust people, they trust the people that they know, and they don't tend to trust like new technologies or governmental actors who they've never talked about. So we wanted to leverage this core piece of information as we started to look at policy proposals that we could use to potentially benchmark and inspire our own one. So I'm going to hand it off to Sriram to go over some pilot programs in both Punjab and India that sort of analyze the efficacy of using this as like the core approach.
Yeah, so if you go to the next slide, we can see three specific studies that we like to point out in other areas of India. So first in Kerala, researchers observed village resource centers, which were holding workshops for adoption of new agricultural techniques. And importantly, the researchers found that farmers actually tended to use second-degree connections and peer-to-peer learning in order to learn these new techniques, as opposed to just learning through these informational sessions. Now, secondly, in Manipur, researchers observed that villages oftentimes have central actors or central nodes in these social networks who act as the primary methods to diffuse information about new agricultural techniques. Importantly, they found that villages are oftentimes open to electing or like informally electing these new village leaders who attend these workshops more often. Now, finally, in Telangana and Jharkhand, researchers found that this network-based knowledge sharing group farming approach is actually more efficient and more beneficial for farmers when compared to the individualistic farming approach, which is commonly used throughout much of India. Now, if we go to the next slide, there are two specific studies in Punjab that we'd like to point out. Both of them focused on water by the PBPK and CWC. They both focused on using a network-based solution to reduce water usage. Most importantly, both of the studies took away that having field-based approaches with on-field support, as well as building trust with farmers, was critical in order to reducing water usage. Now I'll pass it back to Kevin to discuss our solution.
Yeah, so taking our findings from the literature review, we came into our policy proposal with two really key values that we wanted. One, how could we leverage in-person sort of learning? And two, how could we leverage the peer-to-peer effects that Sriram sort of alluded to being extremely effective? So with this in mind, we moved to the stakeholder of our policy solution. We recognize that trust was something that's extremely important, and it isn't something that could be built from the ground up. So Ben, if you can switch the slide. Yeah, so since this isn't something that could be built in a day, we wanted to leverage an existing actor. So we chose ATMA, which is the Agricultural Technological Management Agency. They're a pretty large organization that runs across states in India, and they have a pretty large office in Punjab that runs pilot programs designed to leverage peer-to-peer learning and to launch new agricultural pilot programs. In terms of our policy implementation site, we wanted to practice rolling something out somewhere small and seeing how it works before expanding it elsewhere. So we chose Sangwar, which is one of the hotbeds for farmer protests. And one sort of important thing about those farmer protests is that it sort of signified the existence of social groups, which our literature review identified as like a prerequisite for successful peer-to-peer network effects. So as we move to the next slide, we can go into more specifics about why ATMA and why Sangwar. So one really, really important thing about ATMA is that they have a pretty large unallocated budget. So budget's a very large concern when we're thinking about policy proposals, and the fact that 20% of ATMA's budget was unallocated really made them like a key actor. Another really important thing was just the infrastructure that ATMA already has in these communities. They already have built a trust, and we really wanted to improve the scope and the efficacy of their existing programs. So aside from that, I've already alluded to some of the other specifics about why we chose this actor in this location specifically. So if we move to the next slide, we can go into more detail about which initiative we're actually trying to improve. So we're looking at farmer field school programs, which are specifically like programs that are in-person workshops designed to teach farmers new fertilizer and soil techniques. And we really wanted to improve the scope of this. So we implemented a three-pronged policy proposal designed to improve the existing farmer field schools approach. The first was a data collection prong. The second was a prong designed to increase access for existing farmers. And the third prong was really to diversify the curriculum outside of just seed and fertilizer management. So I'm going to hand it off to Jimena to dive a little bit deeper into what the data collection prong actually entails.
Thank you, Kevin. So the data collection prong has as an objective to measure the efficiency of the FFS program and how well integrated are the farmers' opinions within these programs. So we identified a couple of metrics that we can see on the next slide that choose to probe into the entire environment of our solution. And so so on the farmer side, we thought that the first key step is to identify how many nodal farmers are actually attending these sessions. And the way that we identify what is a nodal farmer is basically asking them how many acquaintances they have outside of their family or household, and how many they interact with, as well as how many household members within their household interact with other people. And so on the lecturer side, we wanted to understand how many attendees they had per session, so keeping track of that, as well as asking them how many new practices or new lessons are being taught in these sessions. And lastly, we think that probing the entire ecosystem is effective if we look at the number density of FFS programs per district. Then this means how many programs are sort of spread out in a standard surface area of the specific Punjab district that we chose. So I'm going to hand it to Sriram next, who's going to talk about the second prong.
Yes, so the second prong of our solution was about increasing access through transportation. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that currently transportation is a problem worldwide, and it has been found to be a problem in implementation of similar programs in places like Latin America. Specifically in Punjab, there are currently 48 sites for FFS workshops. However, each one of these sites has to cover an area of roughly 900 square miles, meaning that a lot of low-income smallholder farmers do not have the means to make bi-weekly long commutes. As Kevin has already told us that Atma currently has 20% of its budget unallocated, we propose that part of that budget be invested in travel reimbursements or travel passes so as to allow low-income smallholder farmers to attend these FFS workshops. Now I'm going to pass it to Ben to talk about our third prong.
Awesome. Thank you. So again, we're going to jump into our third prong here of diversifying the curriculum of these farmer field schools. So first is rotational topics. This is going to be assisting with changing issues that are either specific for a year, such as the effects of climate, such as the effects of COVID-19 on farming practices, or things that are specific to different times of the year, so seasonal topics. Next is going into the topic of sustainable farming. So forward-looking sustainable solutions to climate-related issues or water scarcity-related issues, whether it being revitalized irrigation system or a promotion of more sustainable crops. And next is going to be a discussion of technology and increasing technology literacy. So this could come from exposure to the private sector, to discussion of lessons learned from other states, FFS programs, both other states within India and other parts of the world. And then finally, incorporating an individual discussion time. So working with individual farmers on a one-on-one basis to work through different issues or problems that arise on their respective farmland. And finally, and this isn't listed on the side here, but likewise discussing best practices for management of large social groups. So as we discussed before, we're going to be leveraging pre-existing social networks within Punjab and promoting different ways that they can help facilitate information dissemination, such as with social media groups or establishing channels for different purposes through WhatsApp or other means. So next, we're going to pass it over to Kevin for our conclusion.
Yeah, so just to conclude, in response to increasingly extreme weather conditions, farmers across the world need to increase their yields. India is one of the largest agricultural states in the world, and Punjab is the breadbasket of India. Within Punjab, we've identified a particularly vulnerable aging demographic of farmers who are growing increasingly resistant to change and increasingly distrustful of the government. We know that these farmers at the end of the day trust each other and they trust interpersonal relationships. So we've used this core information to guide a policy proposal. We've identified an actor who is already doing a lot of really great community work, but doesn't really have the scope and the impact sort of necessary to increase change in their existing initiatives. And we've identified a three-pronged approach to really increase that scope and impact. So the three-pronged approach is as follows. One, data collection to better understand the existing problem and understand what farmers want. Two, increasing access of in-person workshops to more and more farmers. And three, really diversifying curriculums of this existing program outside of just fertilizer and seed management. And we think that this policy proposal is pretty feasible and can help bring Punjab into this changing world. So yeah, thanks for listening to the presentation. Hope you enjoyed it.